I did meet Cubans who called for an invasion or some kind of dramatic overthrow of the government by force from the United States. But generally there was just a kind of widespread apathy and depression, that they couldn't see a way to affect change. Cubans can't really affect change at the ballot box. There's only one political party. And the idea that one Cuban said to me, I can only see two options for Cuba, defeat or surrender, and I can't see which of those would leave us with more dignity.
The crisis in the Middle East has shifted Donald Trump's attention away from Cuba, but he has suggested a military operation there is on his to-do list. Recent US sanctions have deepened an already severe humanitarian and economic crisis on a tiny island that's played a remarkably large role in world affairs. Well, in his new book, Mrs. Gargantua, J.S. Tennant tells the story of Cuba through some extraordinary characters, from Columbus and Hemingway to Paris Hilton and a genetically modified super cow. And he joins me now. Hello.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being with us. Let's start with the obvious. Where does the title come from? Who is Mrs. Gargantua?
Well, my title is a playful one. The title actually relates to a gorilla who was raised in Cuba. You mentioned there, questions of size, and I was aware as I wrote this history book about Cuba, these kind of monumental figures have been associated with the island through history, from Columbus, right through to Fidel Castro. And little did I know as I was writing it that Donald Trump would be turning his attentions to the island at the time of the publication. But Mrs. Gargantua was this gorilla raised by a wealthy woman in Havana in the 1930s and then subsequently sold to the circus in the United States, where she became known as Mrs. Gargantua.
Okay. Look, most histories of Cuba start with the revolution. I guess the sort of the modern phase of Cuba. Why did you think it was important to start much earlier than that?
Yeah, I felt that Cuba. It was for that very reason, I think, that so many have been obsessed with Cuba's recent history. Whereas there's so many fascinating episodes. Columbus, for example, who not only is so crucial to an understanding of the Americas generally, and what Westerners came to know as the Americas. He formed many of his misconceptions. He thought he was traveling to China. When he arrived in Cuba, he actually thought he was in China, and many questions that relate to the Americas today were formed at that time. And Cuba's always been this small island that's played such an outsized role in history, and we're seeing that again right now.
Does look, some of the stories you tell revealing Cuba's history are pretty wild. There's a gorilla, as discussed. There's a dead bird given military honours. There's Hemingway there. There's all kinds of celebrities. Is there something about Cuba that kind of promotes and attracts eccentricism?
Well, yeah, this is what I was trying to explore. I think people do have people who maybe never read about Cuba, never visited, do have an idea of Cuba in their mind. And so I was also playing with this idea of Cuba as an imaginary space, and then what I have seen in over 20 years travelling to Cuba myself.
Tell us a bit about that. Firstly, tell us about how it's changed over 20 years, because I guess 20 years ago was a time of extraordinary hope for Cuba, perhaps less so today.
It was, and I suppose when I first went, maybe even a tiny sort of voyeuristic element was involved in the respect that I wanted to visit this last communist country in the West, and I kept going back because I essentially fell in love with the country. And the more I came to know it, the more I realised that my initial impression that this was a place of secrets, untold stories, and very, as you mentioned, eccentric and outlandish stories was the right first impression. So I'm trying to tell a sort of offbeat history of Cuba through some of the stories you mentioned.
How much is Cuba defined by its relationship with the United States, of being forever in the United States' shadow, of being the kind of the enemy in the backyard?
I mean, certainly in the last 100 years, it has been defined by its relationship with the United States. I think it's also a shame that it's in the news cycle now because, once again, the United States has turned its attentions to Cuba. But, of course, before that, this was an island controlled by Spain for 500 years. And when they eventually achieved independence, it was a kind of a nominal independence at the start of the 20th century, and Cuba was transformed into an economic dependency of the United States. And now all signs perhaps point towards a return to that situation.
We'll come to that in a moment. The economic situation on the ground in Cuba, what's it like? Because you make the point that there are more goods in the shops now than you've sort of seen at any time, and yet we do understand Cuba to be economically struggling. The communist system was sort of more or less degraded. Just tell us a bit about what it's like.
Yeah, it's paradoxical, and you often see in the press talk of food shortages, but I felt that wasn't quite right when I was there earlier this year. And on my last visit 2 years ago, as you say, I did see more produce around, but there was a currency reform at the beginning of 2021, which basically led to absolutely rampant inflation. And the problem is around affordability, not access. Well, access through spiraling costs. So yes, there's food, whereas when I lived there in 2010, there wasn't so much food. But it's completely out of the reach of most Cubans on the wages that they're on.
Are there still sort of communist state rations?
Just about. The ration card, which was introduced in 1962 as a temporary measure, is just about existing. But in the last few weeks, the government, which has actually been saying it will do this for about 10 years, is really signalling the end of rationing. So I spoke to friends just last night in Guantanamo City who say there's been no bread, which is normally offered almost free of charge on the ration card that every Cuban has. There hasn't been bread for 2 weeks. There's only a little bit of rice and beans left. And what this means is the maybe 50% of Cubans who still work for the state, who receive state wages, which because of inflation have reduced to about $7 or $8 a month. And the basic rate pensions are even less than that, and now about $6 a month. These are the worst affected people. An egg, for example, costs 50 cents per egg. So you can sort of work out how desperate some Cubans are.
So, right-wing American politics, well, particularly right-wing American politics, but a lot of American politics is obsessed with Cuba, I guess, and that has a lot to do with the sort of the large Cuban diaspora, particularly in the southern parts of the United States. Is it mutual? How much time does Cuba spend thinking about the United States?
They are two countries inevitably interrelated by proximity and shared history. I think they also have many cultural aspects. They share baseball, for example, a highly important thing in Cuba. But, yeah, Cubans right now are angry about the oil blockade, but they feel like it's another element stacked on their shoulders where they've been suffering for a long time, also through their own government, which is clinging to its old economic model, although very recently, just in the last week, they've announced sweeping changes, possibly the biggest economic reforms since the revolution. But there's always delays and massive delays in implementation, and remains to be seen how quickly these changes can be put into place.
How much did the American actions in Venezuela, effectively sort of replacing the government in Venezuela, how much did that impact Cuba? What does it lead people in Cuba to suspect or fear or expect about their future?
Yeah, well, the obvious change was that Cuba lost about 40% of its oil overnight. Mexico and Venezuela were the main providers of oil, which runs the thermoelectric plants in Cuba, which is another reason there's been such a marked increase in blackouts. Just in the last week, there's been 2 nationwide electricity blackouts, so that's 10 million people as Cuba approaches the hottest time of the year without any electricity whatsoever, let alone the transport problems and all the interrelated issues that causes. And that Venezuela was its last and staunchest ally, and most importantly, an ally with oil. So Cuba has increasingly few regional allies. It does feel very isolated.
Are there many people in Cuba who might even yearn for a Venezuela to happen in Cuba, who might yearn for a different regime, a collapse of the government, a normalization of relationships with the United States, or are people very proud of their difference?
Cubans are intensely nationalistic, regardless of whether they're government loyalists or not. And certainly when I was travelling across the island for nearly 2 months in March and April, I did meet Cubans who called for an invasion or some kind of dramatic overthrow of the government by force from the United States. But generally, there was just a kind of widespread apathy and depression, that they couldn't see a way to affect change. Cubans can't really affect change at the ballot box. There's only one political party. And the idea that one Cuban said to me, I can only see two options for Cuba, defeat or surrender, and I can't see which of those would leave us with more dignity, if any.
You write about professors repairing rice cookers on the side and surgeons becoming taxi drivers, and this general sort of atmosphere of downward mobility. Do a lot of people still wish to leave?
Absolutely. Cubans have been leaving in droves for years now. I mean, some estimates, the highest estimates put it that in the last 5 years, up to 25% of the population has left. And among them are mainly sort of young, educated Cubans, which is, awful.
Yeah, sure. Look, finally, I suppose, what's your expectation for what the next couple of years hold? Do you expect that America will intervene militarily, or do you think Iran has put paid to that? I mean, what do you see happening?
Yeah, trying to make these predictions is really looking into a crystal ball or the sort of fruit salad of Donald Trump's policy brain. When I was there, I mean, there's been many suggestions. Trump himself, of course, has said he could take over Cuba. There's rumours flying around all the time. A few weeks ago, I thought the sort of Venezuela-style snatching of some of Cuba's leaders, perhaps Raul Castro, the former president who's 95, was really going to happen. But as you say, I think Iran has slowed things down. There's also been some suggestions that plans are afoot, but Washington didn't want to implement any of them before the World Cup.
Yeah.
It's really difficult to say, but I'm not hopeful for Cuba's situation in the next year or so, I'm afraid.
Understood. Well, the book is Mrs. Gargantua. Jess Tennant, thank you very much indeed.